Thanks, Sivia, and hello, everybody. We do appreciate you taking some time today with us for this discussion. We know it's a stressful and hectic situation for everybody, both on the work front and the home front. So again, much appreciated. We've got a great panel here today to discuss the challenges of rapidly transitioning to a remote engineering team. We will get to those introductions in a minute. So quick look at our agenda today. We're going to take a quick look at what we're seeing out there in the software and cloud industry with regard to this crisis and moving to remote and some of the security risks that we're seeing. And then we'll jump into what will comprise a majority of this session, which is a roundtable discussion and a couple of general sort of topic areas that we think are important for every engineering team to be paying attention to during this time. And then finally, we'll get to your questions. I'll facilitate those, get those in early and often. If we see a question that's really pertinent to the topic that we're talking about, I'll try to jump in and pose that, but we'll definitely be getting those in at the end. So let's see where we are early in this crisis. We actually annually conduct a cloud security survey. This goes out to a few hundred IT ops professionals, cloud engineers, DevOps, DevSecOps, etc. And asks a whole host of questions about cloud misconfiguration risk, challenges in cloud security and compliance, etc. And right before that survey went out, obviously this crisis hit, and so we got a couple of additional questions in just so we could kind of get a better sense of what's going on out there. This one is basically telling us just about everybody is now 100% working remotely from their home. Some of those, 45%, were on teams that were at least partially remote, some remote team members, some on location. 38% were 100% on location and have now transferred to 100% remote. And then 13% were already 100% remote teams. And there's 4% are remaining on location. I would imagine if we conducted that survey this week, we'd see that go down a little bit, but we know that there's probably, a small percentage that for a variety of probable guessable reasons are going to have to remain on location. So of those teams that either were partially remote but partially on location or 100% on location that are now transitioning or have transitioned to 100% remote, we wanted to get a sense of their concern about whether that transition is creating potential security issues. 84% said yes. We think that that's good news because there are obvious security implications with going from on location to remote. So it's good that a vast majority of folks recognize this challenge. And probably presume that most of the folks that are joining us on this call also feel the same way. So thanks again for taking the time. We do know, I started to put together a slide of just a big pile of headlines, but decided not to. You can visit Security Boulevard or HelpNet Security or Dark Reading to see evidence that the bad guys out there are definitely not letting up, and many are taking advantage of all the flying dust out there, people inadvertently letting their guard down during this transition to do their work, whether that's stealing data or causing some other kind of disruption. So unfortunately, while things are really hectic out there, this is actually a really great time to kind of steal your security posture on cloud.
And Drew, so I'm sorry, we put a poll up to get a sense of our viewers as to whether or not they're concerned about ensuring the security of your cloud environment during a transition. to 100% work from home. So if you would take a minute to go ahead and respond, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Sylvia. I'm on full screen on the PowerPoint presentation and didn't see that poll pop up, so appreciate the reminder. So now I'm going to throw this over to my co-founder and CTO at Fugue, Josh Stella, who's going to introduce the round table and kick off our discussion. Take it away, Josh.
Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Sylvia. And thanks for everyone who has joined us today. Drew or Sylvia, can you guys hear me okay?
Yep, you sound good.
Okay, great. This webinar is going to be a little different than the ones we normally do here at Fugue. If you've seen any of our others, they tend to be deep dives with usually one, sometimes two people into a technical topic with demonstration and so on. This is really a roundtable to just discuss what it means to be a distributed workforce, how to do that safely and securely in a cloud environment, where your infrastructure is in the cloud. We're going to cover that, and where you might have users who used to be in an office and are now accessing via remote devices. So I'm just gonna make the intros for folks, and then I'm gonna kick off the conversation. So first, thank you. We have Dave Williams, cloud architect from New Light Technologies. Say hi real quick, Dave, so people can see you.
Everyone, I'm working out of Yorktown, out of my home office, Yorktown, Virginia. Glad to be here.
Thank you, Dave. And I neglected to say I'm working out of my home office studio in Frederick, Maryland. So one of the things I think you'll see in this is you're going to get a little insight into our personal lives, but also your colleagues' personal lives from working from home, which is actually kind of a cool side effect. I also asked Curtis Meisey, our Director of Engineering here at Fugue, to join us. Curtis, could you say hi?
Yeah. Hey there, Curtis here. I'm working from my home office in Sterling, Virginia.
So Curtis runs all the engineering efforts and coordinates those throughout all of Fugue. And we have had historically a mixed in-office and distributed workforce. So we have some experience with it, but we, like many of you, are adjusting to being fully distributed, and Curtis is really at the forefront of that, along with our Director of Security, Wayne Chrisman.
Hello, I'm currently in my basement at the moment, trying to find a quiet spot. I've got two little ones fighting naps. Hopefully you all cannot hear them. Just outside of Martinsburg, West Virginia, in the Eastern Panhandle.
Thank you, Wayne. And Drew, let's go ahead to the next slide. I think Wayne made an interesting point there. I've got a big dog laying here behind me who might also make noise. And one of the kind of nicer things, actually to me, one of the silver linings of the distributed work scenario is it does bring us a little bit closer. And I actually don't mind personally if I'm in a meeting and somebody's kid comes in the room, everyone wants to say hi to the child, or a pet shows up, everyone wants to know the name. It can have a humanizing effect, despite the rather ugly circumstances that might be bringing us a lot of us to this. So we're going to go through a number of topics today. We're going to talk about first, and we'll get into this in a second, we're going to talk about device security, the kinds of security concerns you need to have for the actual remote devices that your team members are going to be logging in with, where they used to be maybe sitting at a desk on a corporate network. We're then also going to talk about the access policies for those devices back to the corporate assets, whether those are in the cloud or not. We're going to talk about the processes the team uses to perform engineering functions in a distributed way, ticketing systems, stand-ups, things like that. And then we're also going to talk about the visibility and control of those corporate assets that are in the cloud. So we're going to go from the edge through the processes, the control policies over these things, and then into the actual assets themselves. And then finally, we're going to talk about how to support your team through a newly distributed kind of work environment. The more social aspects of that, the more interpersonal aspects of that. But we're going to start out with device security. And Wayne, I know you've had to make some changes and adjustments at Fugue as we've gone to a distributed model. Can you walk through a little bit of that and what your concerns were and what areas people need to be concerned with?
Sure. So at Fugue, we were already pretty remote friendly, as Josh mentioned at the outset. So everybody at Fugue as a company issued, device, a laptop, And you may be used to that kind of thing. But for those that do not have that kind of a policy, where they have a desktop at work, and now folks are having to work from home, so there's this mad scramble to either get laptops or devices at home, or have folks using their home computers to access company data, company networks. The things you have to be really aware of is, or the things you have to be concerned with is, how do you get your company's policy onto those devices? You think about using something like a mobile device management system, ensuring things like disk encryption, ensuring your password policies, antivirus, all of that stuff is enabled and enforced somehow. It can be a real challenge if you weren't already in a remote friendly state. Thankfully at Fugue, we already were. We also, actually, we're going to get into VPNs in a few minutes, but I was just about to mention, enforcing VPN for networks that you may not control. So those are the kinds of things you should be aware of. Your device hygiene, screen locking, things like that. And I'll tack onto that. We're seeing a rise in popularity, of course, of things like Zoom, like we're using now. We're starting to see attackers take advantage of the fact that more people are working from home. So you have to think even more about ensuring things like connection security is turned on, the encryption is turned on. You may think about instituting a PIN or a password policy for your personal meeting, or for your work meetings and things like that. Because after all, Zoom URLs are just a public URL. Anybody can just jump in. So those are the kinds of things you have to start thinking about, since you're no longer just yelling over the cue ball or something like that.
Yeah, you brought up a couple of things there, and I want to hear from Dave Williams on this topic too. And guys, feel free to jump in and engage in the conversation without my being in the middle. But a couple of things that you just mentioned. One, in Zoom, you do have an option for making a meeting private, as you mentioned. Just if you're new to Zoom, it's when you establish that meeting on the calendar, you can say whether it's private or public, and if there's a password for it. Wayne, I remember a couple of months ago, so I used to go on the road a lot and speak at events, and I will go up and do demonstrations, at podiums and so on. And I had a device that I had recently purchased to do that with. And you had told me you wanted me to load a bunch of agents on it. And I said, well, one time one of those agents actually made it so I couldn't present. So I don't want to do that. And what you said back to me was interesting. You said, well, what I really need is for you to be able to prove security when it comes time for something like a SOC 2 audit. And you told me what I needed to do. And the reason I bring this up, one, I try to follow all the rules and go by the book, but I did have that experience. And so it was important for me to understand, as in this case, the employee, right? I'm a founder, but Wayne's our director of security. And so he has authority over security above me, even as CTO. I had to respect the requirements, but those requirements were driven by things like provability of security over time. And so that makes a ton of sense. The reason I bring it up is, if you are finding some of your distributed workforce, including executives, are pushing back on certain things, sharing with them the reasons for them can be really powerful to motivating people to find a path through whatever the difficulty is to get to having a secure end device. But Dave, I know you guys have been dealing with this at New Light too. Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences?
Well, yeah, I think actually to one of the points you just made. So 5 or plus years ago, when I got a corporate device from an employer, the MDM, or mobile device management software, was very intrusive. And basically it would root the device. And if I brought my own device in, which is becoming more popular, I have to give up full sort of administrative or root access to that device. It sort of just takes over. What's happened in the last few years, and we're familiar with certain technologies like the technology from Microsoft, Intune, and what you can do now with the MS Office suite on Android and iOS devices is it allows you to run their software sort of in a sandbox, and it doesn't require rooting your device. So if you're concerned about things like data leakage prevention, and I'll give you an example, You have some text in a Word doc on your phone or an email, and you can set a policy like you can't, copy it and paste it into a text message. So there's these very definable guardrails you can put around, but ultimately it's my device. I'm not giving up full control. So I think the industry, when it comes to that balance between usability, protection, sort of smarter ways that we handle those things, has gotten a lot better. But one of the things that we, as I think a lot of organizations are struggling with, or just have to keep in mind, now this is true in the cloud space. We work multi-vendor, but it's also true in our devices. So we're a mix of Windows, and there's some great tech tools natively in Windows with like Azure AD and domain binding without a LAN. So when it comes to managing your Windows laptop, you can do it. You can do your core things like password policies now just natively without having to run a domain controller. But we also have a mix of Apple devices, and I think the industry has seen that. So we see more technology that works across both. Of course, like something like Jamf, which is very Apple specific, has more features there. But at the end of the day, I think we're in a much better place in the ability to protect devices without sort of hampering the end user experience.
Thank you, Dave. One thing, Wayne, that you put out I think it was an XKCD comic strip to folks at Fugue. I had been one of these people that used fairly long passwords, more than a dozen characters, but I thought for some reason that doing things like swapping vowels for numerals and things like that might be helpful. And you pointed out that it's all just entropy to a computer, and what you want is more of it, so you want more bits. Could you speak to that a little bit, and what a good way to get passwords or phrases that might be useful are?
Sure. So for anybody who hasn't seen the XKCD that Josh is talking about, if you just Google correct horse battery staple, you'll find it. And the point of it is to show that in the strip, he basically breaks down common substitutions, things like zeros for O's. You might see a 3 for an E, things like that. It's all just character set to a computer. But you take a short word, you try to mix it up, and you make it hard for a human to guess or remember, but it's easy for a computer to guess. And so the kind of the spoiler for the end is that over the decades we've trained humans to come up with passwords that are hard for humans to remember but easy for computers to guess. We need to flip that, where you want to flip your mindset and stop thinking about passwords and start thinking about passphrases, where you have a long series of words or statements put together that's memorable to you, but introduces a lot of entropy and makes it very, very difficult for a computer to brute force. Instead of taking minutes or even hours, it now takes years or possibly decades or more.
Yeah, so what was the name of that XKCD again, in case people missed it?
The correct horse battery staple.
Okay,
and I see in the chat.
A word to the wise. Don't use correct horse battery staple as your passphrase.
Yeah, don't use that.
And I did just drop a link to that comic in the chat.
Thanks, Curtis. Also, from experience, I can tell you, don't use so long and thanks for all the fish. That's in all the bad guy databases already, too. Anything else on this? Oh, of course, use MFA everywhere. In fact, you might even consider whether you allow service use that isn't MFA for the distributed workforce if it's accessing important corporate data. And I'm just going to make one last point as the moderator here on this one, and we're going to move on to the next topic because I'm keeping track of time here. The last point is, make sure you have record of this stuff. Make sure you're in constant communication with your director of security, because one of the side effects of getting out of whack on this stuff can be pretty severe corporate governance issues around things like if you live in a world where you have to maintain SOC 2 compliance or PCI compliance or HIPAA or GDPR, you want to make sure you're not doing that. Last point, if you use cloud storage for your files rather than local file servers, something like Dropbox or Google or what have you, there are a lot of benefits to that. Of course, you should be using on-disk encryption on your local devices so that the data can't be stolen from the local device. But you also want to be very concerned with things like ransomware. Well, guess what? If you're using cloud storage that has versioning built in, that's much less of a concern. I'll go around the panel. Any last comments on device security before we move on to access policies?
I've got 3 super quick ones, Josh. Just there's some great websites. If you want to see how long it takes to brute force your password, just search that term, and you'll see that long term's way harder to crack than some complex short term. Second is use a password manager. Third term is there's some great sites out there that will tell you if your password has been found, like in Pastebin. So check that out.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, Drew, let's go on to access policies. So when we're talking about access policies, we're talking about how we are determining whether and when who can access what data, what endpoints, et cetera. And I know, Curtis, you've put a lot of work into this at Fugue in terms of how our engineering team operates. Can you walk us through a little bit of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess in general terms, I'm always surprised by the amount of time I spend managing access actually for the team. I was just looking, and I think it's something like a couple dozen third-party services, we use as a team to stay connected, to share information, Jira for tickets, Slack, all these tools, and they all need to be, kept in line and follow your access policies. And it frankly is just a lot of work to make sure that across all those services, you've approached security in the right ways. So we use Okta, for example, to manage access to all those things and provide access like on an individual basis to certain apps, to certain AWS accounts, to Microsoft Azure, and so on. And so that's just one example where the access policy is coming into play now. And especially as, your team has lots of changes going on, potentially in terms of like job responsibilities. Maybe you've got folks that, miss half day as they're with their family and you need somebody to fill in. In times like these, there just might be a lot of change that happens in terms of who needs access to what. And it's important to keep on top of that change and make sure that you're still acting in accordance with your security policies and your access policies.
That brings up an interesting topic. I just heard I was at an event a couple of weeks ago where I was speaking, and so was the CTO of SSH.com, and they have a product called Privex. I'm not pitching that product. There's just an interesting approach to this problem of particularly elevated access securities and putting time windows around elevation of access and knowing, exactly who needs that elevated access to what purpose, making sure it's logged and recorded and so on. And I wonder, both Dave and Curtis, not necessarily that product, but just generally on elevated access privileges, how are you guys handling that? Maybe kick that to Dave first.
So we're small enough where we still haven't implemented a real solution, I would say. Although in some prior career experience, I was part of organizations where, for example, we ended up using CyberArk, and what it allowed us to do is to put firm time limits on when certain folks can get access in an elevated manner. It would track keystrokes, it would record sessions. So it's putting it's really protecting the ability, hardening and protecting the experience that a user would have getting into an environment, so that once that session is up, they couldn't go back in. They would never see keys. Keys are rotated programmatically. But CyberArk is one. Azure AD has what's called privileged identity management, which is sort of a lightweight version of what CyberArk does, but it does a lot of the core things. So those are areas to start if you're starting to tackle this problem.
Yep, absolutely. And then on our part, I think Okta, which I mentioned before, which is an identity management solution that some of you have probably heard of. You know, I help manage rotation of responsibilities in a couple cases, and so part of like a shift change effectively is somebody gaining access to different AWS accounts and losing access to different AWS accounts. And so that, you know, we have in process form, and, you know, hopefully you have some services and tools that can help you manage that without it being a big disruption.
You know, one thing that
Tangential, just real quick, Josh, just I think one of the most important thing folks can do, or at least that we have done, even we're not that large, but we have dozens of AWS accounts and Azure accounts, is SSO. So our identity actually comes from G Suite, right? And we've got it SSO'd, for example, into AWS via the SSO service. And what this means is we have a unified place of where we can do authorization against accounts, but most importantly, or one of the most important things is if something goes south, we can just terminate a user one place in G Suite, and it provisions out to all the AWS accounts, all the Azure accounts, all the GitHub accounts, all the fresh, everything. So it's that, you know, pulling access back during an event, the SSO is so important.
That's an excellent point. And I think we use Okta, you're using the Google identities, but you know, those of us who go back a ways, we were always working on getting Active Directory full federation to work. And one of the neat things to see has been in the last really handful of years, these services come out that are just very, very well supported. Of course, our product in Fugue, we do the same thing. We support SSO and thereby MFA. We also have our own MFA. But the recognition that that is critically important to have like a single place where you can manage those users is a big piece of this. I do want to point out that when you're dealing with cloud infrastructure, there's another dimension to this, which is you really never want anyone to ever be root in a cloud account. What you want are administrative access to different purposes. And one example of that, you probably don't need the ability to modify IAM permissions or logging settings if you're going in to do maintenance on a system. You might. So you might want to separate those administrative functions so that there is no ability to fully control that cloud environment from any one account, and therefore the ability to grant those privileges in time-boxed windows and to do the appropriate actions makes you that much safer. All right, I'm looking at time. Going through, we talked about IAM, we talked about privilege, we talked about MFA. Oh, finally, this is maybe to those of us who've been living in cloud for years, an obvious thing. But when you're talking about your access keys associated with your cloud accounts, those really shouldn't be, root shouldn't be on anyone's disk ever. Root should be a highly, highly restricted access kind of thing. But generally speaking, you should be using things like Okta or like Google to do the mappings so that you're not passing around things like secret keys and keeping them in places where they can end up being used for exploits. One of the things I get to do at Fugue is when there's a cloud exploit, go try to recreate how it happened and read all the docs and forensics that may or may not be available. Hopefully they are. Very, very often, cloud exploits, even really big ones, are due to somebody having access keys and secret keys stored in plain text on a file system that ends up in a backup or something like that. So,
one way to mitigate against that, that's, for example, part of the AWS SSO service, is that you can force rotation of keys and per session. So when you go to access the SSO environment in AWS, you just literally, you know, hey, if you're using Mac, copy this, drop it into your config. But it allows you very easily to force the rotation of keys so that even if someone left it on their machine and it got stolen or compromised, that's an expired key set that couldn't be used for an exploit.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things we can check for at Fugue. We do cloud infrastructure security, is we can check and tell you whether or not your resources have appropriate key rotation policies. But key rotation policies are absolutely critical. I was reading about an exploit a few months ago that a years old key was still working, and that should just never happen. So I think generally when you're talking about distributed work and cloud infrastructure and how those relate, you can really trust the cloud provider to secure their part of that shared security model, right? Their data floors, whether the hypervisor is secure to the VMs or the containers or the serverless functions, that they're really good at that stuff. Where people get in trouble is they do things like don't rotate keys. And man, that's a huge opportunity for bad guys. Okay, I'm watching time here. Let's go on. Well, I'm going to go around the horn again. Does anyone have anything else they'd like to talk about regarding access policies before we move on to processes?
I would just add one quick note, which is like, given the breadth of services that many teams use now and how much there is to worry about, you really need to look for automation, right? To help manage this, because doing it manually is just not going to work. So, you know, automating checks, automated alerts, Fugue can help with this, and, you know, various other services can help with that as well.
You know, that's an excellent point. One of the things that we see more and more is the bad guys are using automation. So the bad guys are out there with programs looking for flaws in your security. And what that means is you don't have a whole lot of time. So employing automation and being really aware of what's going on in the cloud environment, and we're going to get to this in a little bit after processes. We're going to talk about visibility and some other things, is critically important to automate those things. Okay, let's move on to processes. So what we mean by these are things like the ticketing systems in use, the code reviews, some of the informal practices, and so on. Let me just ask, is there a panelist who'd like to maybe take the lead on this one?
I can speak to him, and I'll be brief, Josh. I know just at a time.
Oh no, go ahead, Dave.
So
we're just a time check for the panelists. We're 35 minutes in. We want to leave 10 at the end. So yeah. Go ahead, Dave.
So Telcon for code reviews, you know, merges. Something that I've been experimenting with lately is what's called VS Code Live Share, which opens a collaborative editing session for peer programming. It's pretty cool. It's a little bit, a lot of it probably has to do with me learning it, but it's getting on a call with someone and checking what we're doing, rather, because, you know, you can't grab them and say, hey, come over to my cube and help me out here. So, but VS Code Live Share is something pretty cool if you haven't heard of it. One of the things that we've at NLT been pushing is we use a customer-facing ticketing system. It's called Freshdesk. It's you know, there's a bunch of them out there. We like Freshdesk, but we started pushing it more for internal support, so that if someone needs help with something like, you know, I'm just making this up, getting the printer working, right? We don't forget about it because we're not seeing each other face to face. So it's using those sort of automation and tools that we normally use with our customers internally, and starting, you know, especially in the remote space, formalizing conversations that generally would happen organically, so we don't forget about them. So, hey, you know, once a month, we normally review an invoice on our cloud accounts, and we check for anything we can reduce the bill. Well, we may not have that conversation because I'm not seeing Bob or Alice in the hallway. Let's grab 30 minutes and we'll do it. Just making sure we don't forget to have a conversation we normally do. And then, you know, there's lots of communication tools. We're kind of in communication overload. I'm always a big fan of the phone. If you text me on Slack or my phone or email, or the 9 other ways I get messages, and I have any trouble understanding what you're doing, I say, let's grab a quick chat. Voice-to-voice comms, in my opinion, there's no replacement for them. That's my quick feedback.
Dave, thank you. I'm going to echo a couple of those things. So I think that, you know, for those who go back a little ways, when Slack became this powerhouse, a number of us were saying, oh, internet relay chat is now part of corporate America. And if you're not familiar, IRC is how like a lot of open source got built. A lot of the things you use every day got built. And I think that's testament to the fact that you can do this. This is actually how, the Linux kernel has been built and maintained over time. This is how the primary internet protocols, going back to the RFC days, were done. Distributed engineering, there's been a trend recently that you have to all be in the same office. It's really nice to be in the same office. But guess what? Probably most of the stack that we're all running right now to talk to each other on this Zoom was done via very distributed. And we talk about remote. I like the term distributed because distributed says there's no center and orbits. It's a number of human beings all using these tools to communicate. And I think one of the things you pointed out in that, Dave, that's really true is there are two kinds of communication: asynchronous, which is probably most of what you're going to do. Asynchronous chat, Slack is semi-asynchronous, right? Because the thread goes by. But it is async. You don't have to reply immediately. You can look back through the thread. You can reply when you want to. And the other is fully synchronous in the form of a phone call or a Slack call or a Zoom meeting like this. And the reason we're doing video on this one, and we never have before, is to kind of show, this is what it feels like to do this a little bit. And I'm sure everyone's experiencing it too. But those have very different purposes, async and synchronous. Async tends to work better for larger groups. On a Slack call, maybe a dozen or so starts to get a little strained, but on a Zoom call, but on a Slack channel, you can have the entire company there and people will raise their hand by posting to something that's appropriate as they see it. But synchronous communications convey a lot more information, right? If I can see your face, if I can hear the tone of your voice, and this becomes more critical the less face time you have. So in terms of those two styles, I just wanted to comment on that. They've been around for a long time, and you can build just as good, if not better, software in a distributed way as you can, everyone getting together in a room. Any other comments from the panel on process? I know, actually, Curtis in particular, I know you've got some thoughts here, and I've watched you really craft our processes inside of Fugue to be capable for our remote, our distributed engineers and the guys in office. Do you have a few comments for us?
Yeah, I would just say that there's, it takes a lot of work to find the right balance. As Josh has said, we're pretty remote friendly, but at the same time, there's always a lot of important conversations that happen in person. And so with everybody remote, you do really have to think consciously about what's the right set of meetings to have for the team every week. And, that's a mix of formal meetings, maybe a handful of new ones, but also, looking for a way to add some social interaction that folks aren't getting any other way. So from my point of view, yeah, it's just been, it's something you have to work at and find what works best for your team now in this change of situation.
I'd also tack on real quick to just be flexible, because you may have processes that have always been in person and you've never done, or the doing them via video call or something or on the phone is the exception rather than the rule. For example, we do a quarterly planning session where we take a couple of days and we sit down as a team in the same room. We've got things up on whiteboards, we've got stuff on the screen. And now we're having to tackle doing that remotely, whereas distributed, whereas we haven't done that before. So there is some amount of flexibility that's required in this kind of a situation.
Yeah, and to some degree, it's like, if you're familiar with sprint retrospectives, your team has to now think about how things are working in this distributed environment and talk about ways you need to change your process to accommodate this different situation, whether that's more meetings, different meetings, choosing to use different tools for communication.
Yeah, I've seen a number of people commenting online that just sitting on Zoom all day isn't great. I'll say that, you know, at Fugue anyway, we have not been doing that. I think that, you know, maybe that's a side effect of cultures that were over meeting heavy to begin with in terms of sitting on Zoom all day, but you don't need to do that. You really don't. It is important, I think, to see each other's faces from time to time, to hear each other's voices. But a lot of this can be done very much respecting people's time. And you know, the context of the conversation today isn't just about distributed teams and distributed engineering. It's about distributed engineering during a global pandemic that we've never experienced before. And I just want to acknowledge that at the same time we're learning to do distributed things, those of us who haven't done it before, we're also doing it in a context of, you know, a lot of insecurity and a lot of need for flexibility by the team members. So somebody joked at me this morning that they saw I was posting on Slack at 4 a.m. I was up for a few hours in the middle of the night because I wanted to do a conversation with somebody a long way away from here. And I think having an attitude of being like deeply flexible and understanding of each other's circumstances, especially in this scenario, is incredibly important, and doing distributed work can actually really help with that. Okay, I want to move on to the next topic, which is visibility and control. And what we mean by visibility and control is we talked about the edge devices. Here we're talking about the whole stack. You know, we talked at first about the remote devices and how to secure your laptops and phones and such. But here we're talking about everything from the infrastructure, the infrastructure as code, and using things like policy as code, having visibility into what components are going into software and how to kind of deal with that in a cloud world where what we're seeing is actually an acceleration of cloud adoption right now. And so we want to dig a little deeper here into how to get that cloud environment visible and get continuous visibility into that state. So just to preamble this a little more, the things you really need to be super concerned with, we know from surveys that we've done in the past, are things like identity on cloud, security groups, etc. So Wayne, how are we doing that at Fugue?
So frankly, Fugue uses Fugue for one thing. That's what we do. It's kind of our bread and butter. That's at the cloud end of the stack. Talking about device visibility, we, like Josh said, we talked about securing your end devices, and Dave mentioned tools like Jamf. There's another one. There are several of them out there, but we use Jamf, for example, for getting visibility on what policies are on our devices. Are things turned on that we need turned on? Full disk encryption was mentioned. That's another thing. We talked about processes before, just continuing to make updates or any changes and sticking to your deployment processes, those kinds of things. Instituting policy as code. You want to drive that automation, like Curtis talked about earlier. Those are the kinds of things we're trying to continue to embrace. We have used in the past, and we're just trying even more now to use them to our advantage.
Let me give Josh just piggyback on one thing said, and this is about the actual Fugue tool. And so we have a small team. We have lots of accounts, Azure and AWS. What we do is every account or environment in sort of the Fugue world, basically an instance of Fugue applied to a cloud environment, a cloud account. We get a daily report of any changes, aka drift. And what we do is we have that come as an email that gets fed into our internal ticketing system and assigned to an engineer just to review what's changed. So because everyone's working remote and from home, we're not always aware that, hey, in this account, even if it's a dev account, you know, this was turned on or this was done. So it's a very effective way for us to get really complete oversight and visual and to everything that's changing across our AWS and Azure environments. Most of those we just go, yep, that's cool. We just, you know, close the ticket because we're just aware. But it allows us to really proactively say, oh man, that, you know, security group shouldn't have been changed. Or even, hey, now that you've added this resource, let's talk about when you're going to destroy it because it's costly. So it is a super easy and effective way to get really complete oversight across the many accounts across different cloud providers that we use.
Thank you, Dave. Let me just chime in on that real quick, and I'll go to you, Wayne. I just want to say thank you very much, Dave, for saying that about our tool. We've really tried to make it that way. I think there's an interesting point here, which is a lot of folks fear cloud because it can change quickly and because it does. And they fear that from a security perspective. But there's a flip side to that, which is because cloud is driven by APIs, for the first time ever, you can actually be aware of every change that happens in the cloud environment. And so with proper tooling and approaches and processes, that's something you never had in the data center, to be honest with you. So sorry, I just wanted to get that in. Wayne, you had a comment.
Yeah, and it was about what David said about driving things with tickets. Everybody, it's reviewed. You know, if everything looks good, when we close it and move on. I'll say that the future you is going to really be thankful for the past you driving everything in tickets when you go to when you come to be audited, because that's the kind of evidence that you'll of course need. So, and I was also going to say this. We mentioned continuous visibility. This isn't about visibility just from, you know, okay, it's Tuesday, I got this email, I got this ticket, I'm going to check that and move on. We're talking about visibility from, you know, the time of inception or the time that you turned your tooling on up till the present, and that you can prove that you can show how you've changed, how your security posture has changed over time. And that's a really valuable and important thing to have, especially when it comes to auditing.
Yeah, Wayne, that's an excellent point. And by the way, for those of you who aren't familiar with Fugue, that's a lot of what we do. There is a free forever version that you can start using today, and we encourage you to try it. It's free forever. So we want to help you get your hands around this stuff up to a certain scale. That is definitely an aspect that I've always believed, and that we as a team have always believed, that having that complete history of the system and all of its configurations is critical. The last thing I'll throw in here, well, let me go around the panel first before we move to the last topic and then questions. Anyone have any more comments on visibility and control? Curtis?
I actually wanted to throw a question back out to Dave, because you mentioned dev accounts, and that got me thinking, you know, we're all sort of physically distributed now, but people need to realize that their AWS or Azure environment is sort of distributed between kind of production environments that you might be paying a lot of attention to from a security perspective, but also like dev environments and these kinds of things. And you know, can you talk just briefly about the importance of security for the dev environments that all your developers are using?
Yeah, so this is an interesting topic that's, you know, more than we have 10 minutes, so I'll try and be super quick. My opinion is the dev environments in a lot of ways pose more risk than production environments. They are by nature more open, they're more fluid, and in most development shops, you have many more folks making changes, right? So developers are deploying infrastructure with their code. Once you get to some sort of production environment, it's very locked down. So I think it's almost more important to apply the rigor and the mindset to protecting your development environments. I mean, test data management, data scrubbing, even if you're really good at that, there's IP, there's bits of data there, there's and once you can get into an environment, there's ways to move laterally. So I think that if you're just focusing on securing production, I think you're, you know, in a way seeing the tip of the iceberg. I could keep going, but I don't want to go too long.
I was clapping on mute there. You're so right. I can't tell you how many times I have seen in the forensics of a breach keys that were useful in production in a dev environment backup that was stored somewhere in plain text because it wasn't being scrutinized, just as one example of that. And I know Wayne did this whole webinar, I think it was last year, showing how to do lateral movement across accounts if you have IAM misconfigured. So there's lots of vectors, and the bad guys are super clever. I think it's really important to preserve the spontaneity and creativity of the developers, but you really have to be watching those accounts too, because they are attack surface. Anything else on this topic, Drew, or anyone else on visibility and control? We're down to 7 minutes. I want to make sure there's time for Q&A, and I just wanted to say a few things on supporting the team. So, you know, this isn't just, as I mentioned earlier, this the reason we're all here today is because a lot of folks are getting distributed because of a very scary crisis that we're facing. And so supporting the team becomes that much more important, right? Being distributed brings its own challenges, and the fact that we're facing down COVID together brings another set of challenges. And I think it's critically important for organizations, whether you're a corporation or a non-for-profit or a government agency, especially leadership, to inculcate support for those teams in the organization. So a few thoughts here. One, if your leadership, do ask us anything and mean it, and be honest about the responses. I think that what we see in leadership we trust are people who are honest about what we're facing, because guess what? Your team is smart. They don't need sugarcoating. They need honest answers and an honest dialogue. And the degree to which you can open that up in that way is helpful. One of the things we do at Fugue is every Friday at 4:30, we have a virtual happy hour, including a competition on backgrounds. And in Zoom, you can do what I'm about to do. You can do that and suddenly be in the TARDIS. You see Wayne and Drew have theirs up. It's kind of fun. I always lose that competition because our team are much cooler than I am. But things like that. Other things, use Slack channels openly and encourage them for non-work related stuff. So a couple at Fugue that are popular are cats and dogs. And another one is music. So we're sharing things to try to maintain that interpersonal interaction that leads to support in a difficult time. Some other things, some folks say set a routine when working from home. That works for some folks. For other folks, don't. You decide. Figure out what works for you. I keep weird sleep hours, so I don't really set a routine. I make sure I'm at my meetings, but I might work from 2 till 4 in the morning. And if you see somebody else doing that, that's cool. Other people might be at their keyboard at 8 and working till 6. Do what works for you. Figure out what works for you. And if you're a manager or a leader, allow your team to figure out what works for them, so that you can leverage their best capabilities. Finally, either you can set your working hours on a calendar. If you have young kids at home, they're not going to respect that. So as Wayne knows, so work with your spouse, work with your significant other. If you have young kids at home, if you're lucky enough to have that situation, if you're flying solo and you're single, figure out what schedule works for you. But I think the main thing is when we're dealing with a distributed team and we're dealing with a difficult time, which we are, is to respect and play to each other's strengths. Is to be flexible and understanding and empathetic of what the other person is doing and their unique capabilities. One of our absolute best engineers, all our engineers are great. One of our standout engineers is in many time zones away right now. And, we just try to work with that. Other ones who are local have young kids in the house. So we work with that too. And sometimes those things work together beautifully, because the guy with young kids might be up at a strange hour and the guy in Singapore or Thailand, he's in Thailand this week, might be doing something else. So with that, any last comments from the panel before we go to questions?
Josh, I hope I'm going to pronounce this right. Gourmet, one of our attendees, says they use an open hangout with different company-related themes for team members to get a view into what's going on elsewhere in the company. So that's a
awesome idea.
Gourmet is actually the NLT owner.
Okay, very cool.
And he's been if you've met him, I mean, he's been super supportive of a lot of the things we're talking about here. But Gurma, I'm glad you're here. Glad you can make it.
Yeah, thanks for joining. And that's an awesome idea. I mean, one of the things that we're observing here, and by going on video, like it's good to just have a more open dialogue distributed where we're used to being maybe a little more formal. Anything else from the panel or any questions from the audience, Drew?
We got a couple here. One, this might be a good one for Wayne, wants to know how audits might go forward in this crisis, because they tend to be on-site audits.
Yeah, it's definitely a tricky thing because auditors tend to come on site and conduct interviews. They'll sit with you at the keyboard. They want to see things as it exists. All of that certainly could be done remotely, over a Zoom call or something. I suspect a lot of that will be taking place there. But there may be situations where, you need to look at something like a gap system where you have no connectivity, or maybe it's just too sensitive to put out over any communication channel. So I don't really have an answer, unfortunately, because it's still a really open question, because it's just the nature of our world right now. I expect most of them can be done remotely, but some will present an interesting challenge going forward. You might see delays and things like that, but ultimately the best thing is to work with your auditors, figure out what's going to work for you, and what's acceptable to everybody involved.
Great. James is interested in our predictions on what changes are happening now that we think will be permanent.
I'll start that one. A lot of them. The movement of, I think one of the things that's going to happen from this is people are going to realize that distributed work is efficacious, that it works well for maybe things they hadn't realized. I think we're also seeing a lot of movement to cloud right now, and you can see stories in the Wall Street Journal and other places that are saying that. So I think a fair amount of this will stick, and I've been taking a lot of time. So let's go around the panel. Curtis, what do you think?
Yeah, I think a lot of teams are going to find that they're quite effective in distributed form, actually. So I suspect that will stick to some degree, although, there's a lot of people that like being in the office too, so it's not going to be a switch, but it'll definitely keep us moving in that direction.
Wayne, any thoughts on that?
I have it'll sound like it's not related, but I think it actually has everything to do with the situation we're in. And that is to, follow your mother's advice, eat your vegetables, get your rest, get some exercise, because you're no good to anybody if you completely burn out. And that includes your work life and your home life.
Just to piggyback on that, I've over my career, which is longer than I'd like to admit, I've had long stints doing distributed work. It's really easy to burn out doing distributed. And the reason is you are your own worst critic most of the time. Like, you're worried about what your boss thinks of you, but when you're left on your own, you're probably going to drive yourself harder. Wayne's advice is excellent. Make sure you take care of yourself. Dave, any quick last thoughts, because we're running out of time here?
I had a call with a friend of mine who's a CTO of a company this morning, and they, prior to this pandemic, were the CEO was anti-remote, and they have completely shown that it's can be effective, and are actually changing their corporate viewpoint on this because of it. So basically just parroting that I think this is going to have some long-term effects and show that remote teams can be effective.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the rules for doing distributed in meetings and webinars is to keep schedule discipline. We lost that a little bit, so I want to wrap it up here. Drew, do you want to take us out with these resources?
Sure. So we did want to avoid kind of the bullet-laden presentation deck for this in favor of a conversation, but we do have a blog post that we published that we collaborated with Dave on, and you can find that at fugue.co/distributed, and it's got a lot of kind of steps and links and information that you can that we talked about today. And it's all right there for you to check out. And we have a Fugue developer, which is a free service for individual cloud engineers to use to basically very quickly kind of get a compliance and security posture snapshot of your cloud environment, and visualize that, and continue to use that to just kind of be able to move fast and keep your cloud infrastructure secure. So check that free service out as well. And again, want to thank everybody for joining us today. This was a lot of fun. Stay safe out there, support your team, and reach out if you need help. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to all the panelists.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Dave, Wayne, Curtis, Sivia.